Welcome to People and Profit. I'm Kate Moody. Our guest today is the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, joining us from the COP26 summit in Glasgow, Scotland. Thanks so much for being with us today. Now, you've told leaders at this international meeting on climate change that there is still a large gap in terms of ambition and policy before the world can meet its target on cutting carbon emissions. Just how big is that gap?
When we look at the commitments to net zero by mid-century, the gap is closing fast. One of the impressive achievements in Glasgow is that both public and private sector recognizes that going to net zero is a one-way street. But when we look at the pledges for cutting emissions by 2030, the story is much more worrisome. We have to go down by almost 50% by the end of this decade if we are to keep 1.5 degree Celsius target alive. And the sum of commitments we have falls far short, somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 only of what is required. This is why what we are urging is attention on accelerating ambition and accelerating policy action that can make this ambition possible to achieve.
So concretely, how do we get there? This is about more than just commitments.
There are two things that must happen. The first one is to create an incentive for accelerated decarbonization for producers and also for consumers. And we know that the best way to do that is through a carbon price. Make carbon more and more and more expensive over time. Today, the global price of carbon is $3 a ton. By 2030, if we want to reach our targets, it should be over $75 a ton. What we propose from the IMF is, we call it international carbon price floor, bringing all big emitters and then agreeing on a level of carbon price that is corresponding to level of development. Richer countries would pay more, the poorest countries would pay less, and they will be helped. The second action that we need to see is redirecting investment, both public and private, on a scale and preferably in a coordinated manner. The EU New Generation EU Fund is an example of doing exactly that. So imagine that we have one for the whole world. And of course, poor countries must be helped. We are still waiting to see where we would land on the promise of $100 billion each year during this decade. And there are still days to go. Hopefully this promise will be honored, because that would bring us so much more together to deal with the challenge that no country can address on its own.
Now, there is a real price to fighting climate change. The global economy, we know, is at a precarious point, trying to emerge from the pandemic recession. Can policymakers really balance those two goals, and how?
The pandemic taught us a very important lesson, that when we are determined, we can mobilize trillions of dollars to address a problem that is suffocating our societies. In this particular case, we saw over $16 trillion mobilized so we can keep businesses running and households being able to sustain themselves. When we look at the climate crisis, we are projecting somewhere between $6 and $10 trillion necessary to get the mitigation plans implemented. It is not out of reach for a over $80 trillion a year economy, global economy. So the issue here is less one of money. We heard that private sector is stepping up as well, $130 trillion pledging to go to net zero. The question is getting the money to work fast for this transition and to recognize that if we do so, we actually are generating growth and we are generating green jobs. We calculated that a concerted green investment push over 2 decades, this and the next, is going to lift up growth by 2 percentage points and will add 30 million good, well-paying green jobs. So we have to think of this climate crisis also as our once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make it so that our people are more resilient and our planet is more resilient and the quality of life improves. You know that cutting pollution also means fewer people dying because of particulates in air. We have multiple benefits of this change, and we only need to recognize that this is what we must do for the sake of our children and the sake of our planet.
Advanced economies in recent years have committed huge sums of money to help emerging economies meet those climate obligations. The actual financing, though, has fallen short. How do you encourage rich countries to pick up more of the bill and then actually pay what they've promised?
We are in Scotland, where Adam Smith was born. And Adam Smith said, you get your dinner not because the butcher or the butler wants to be nice to you, but for their own self-interest. Advanced economies need to recognize that it is in their self-interest to help emerging markets and developing countries take this green turn. Why? Because if they don't, we will be in a place where advanced economies are cutting emissions, and actually they are already doing that, but this is compensated by increase in emissions elsewhere, and the result is a planet that is barely livable. If we do not stay at the Paris Agreement targets, what we would see over the next decades is more climate shocks, more displaced, desperate people, more pressures everywhere. And let's remember, the climate crisis is not one that only stays in other people's countries. It affects us all. So enlightened self-interest must drive rich countries' actions at the summit, but most importantly, afterwards.
And is that message being received at COP26?
It is resonating at the COP much more than I remember it from attending previous COPs. There is a striking difference in tone. In previous COPs, there was a lot of finger pointing. You must do this. In this COP, much more the conversation is about what can I do. In our case, the IMF, what we do is to integrate climate in everything we are engaged on, because climate shocks are a risk to macroeconomic and financial stability, and with the same token, climate action is an opportunity for growth and employment. We are coming to the COP with a lot of new work on how we manage climate-related financial stability risks, how we inform decision makers so they are able to integrate carbon price in an effective manner, and also how we can contribute to funding this transition. Our membership blessed the creation of a new resilience and sustainability trust at the IMF that would provide longer-term concessional financing to help vulnerable countries deal with the risk of climate and capture the opportunity of transition.
Let's focus specifically on coal power. It's one of the most polluting sources of energy. We know the G7 is trying to transition away from it, South Africa beginning to phase it out. But countries like China are more reliant on coal than ever. How can economies tackle their coal usage, especially when many of them are facing an energy crisis?
We do need to recognize that decarbonization targets cannot be reached unless we find a pathway out of coal and over time out of hydrocarbons. How can we do that? By stepping up both technology transfer and financial transfers to go to the poorer countries so they can develop alternatives fast. We have to recognize the dilemmas these countries are facing. For example, Indonesia does want to phase out coal, but they need to step up renewables and exceed what they're going to close down because of their growing economy and growing population. So it is paramount to use every possible opportunity to support the transition to low carbon energy, low carbon transport in the developing world. And in that sense, what is being discussed about South Africa is a very good example. We cannot expect developing countries to close down coal-fired power plants, and this is expensive, and build new alternative energy at the same time. They need to get help on both counts so they can move forward faster. As for the large emerging market economies that have the resources, it is so very important that they move in lockstep with the Paris Agreement on phasing out coal.
How should we view Narendra Modi's commitment to make India carbon neutral by the year 2070? It seems like quite a long time off. He says the economy should be allowed to grow over that period. What's the IMF's view?
Well, this is the first time India is making a commitment to net zero. And in that sense, we welcome what Prime Minister Modi did. It sends also a signal to other developing countries that we ought to transform, and time is running short. He also made some short-term commitments on renewable energy. Let me go back to the point that we are mostly concerned about 2030, what the world is going to do in the next years, because if we miss this decade, all these wonderful speeches about mid-century commitments may not be leading to implementation, may not be leading to results. So just to say we welcome a commitment, and we would like to see a lot of action by India, by everybody throughout this critical decade. Everybody has to do more.
Just switching tone a little bit, just to end with...
And of course, rich countries, I just want to say rich countries have more means, so they have to do more than the poorer world.
And we are certainly seeing that disparity in commitments and in funding coming from different kinds of economies there. Just briefly, the IMF's board has recently expressed its confidence in you after these allegations of a data rigging scandal while you worked at the World Bank. You've denied those claims. It has, though, been something that your shareholders are keeping an eye on. Are you at all worried that this issue could tarnish the reputation of the IMF?
I'm very pleased that once I presented my side of the story, the IMF board confirmed full confidence in my leadership. We had fantastic annual meetings, and what I saw there is such a sound support for the work of the IMF on many counts, including on addressing the climate crisis. We have fantastic staff at the IMF. We do really high quality work, and we will continue to do so.
All right, Kristalina Georgieva, head of the International Monetary Fund, thank you so much for joining us on People and Profit from the COP26 Summit. And thank you for watching. Don't forget you can get in touch with all your comments and questions on social media. Stay tuned to France 24.